You are not who you think you are. That sentence feels uncomfortable because something inside you already knows it. There are moments in your life where you speak, act, and even think differently depending on who is watching, as if multiple versions of you take turns living your life without asking permission. And the unsettling part is, you rarely notice the switch happening. One version of you exists for approval, another for confidence, another for silence. But here is the question that quietly disturbs everything. Which one is actually you? The version you show when you're alone in a room no one will ever see, or the carefully shaped version you perform in front of others? Over time, the line between performance and personality begins to blur. You stop noticing where the mask ends and the self begins. And what makes this even more disturbing is that the mask was never fully chosen. It was built slowly, shaped by reactions, approval, rejection, and fear. So when you ask who you really are, there is no immediate answer. Only a silence that feels like it already knows too much. And in that silence, something begins to shift. Because if identity is performed, then reality itself becomes uncertain. You start observing yourself more than living as yourself. And that awareness changes everything you thought was stable. Until eventually, even your most natural reactions begin to feel rehearsed. Not because they are fake, but because you are now watching them happen. And once you see this, you cannot fully unsee it. The world does not change, but your relationship with your own reflection does. Every interaction becomes a stage, every silence a hidden script. And somewhere beneath all of it, a deeper question begins to rise, quietly demanding to be explored next. The mask doesn't begin as deception. It begins much earlier, in a place where you are simply trying to survive being understood. In childhood, you quickly learn that certain versions of you are accepted more easily than others. A cry that gets attention is repeated. A truth that gets ignored slowly disappears. A behavior that earns approval becomes something you repeat without thinking. Not because you are pretending, but because your nervous system is learning what keeps connection intact. In those early environments, identity is not chosen. It is adjusted. You don't say, I will become this person. Instead, you unconsciously shift until rejection becomes less likely and recognition becomes more consistent. And slowly, these adjustments stop feeling like adjustments. They start feeling like you. This is where the mask is born, not as a lie, but as a protection layer. At first, it is flexible. You use different versions of yourself in different spaces, not realizing you are building a system of adaptation. But repetition has a quiet power. The more a behavior is rewarded, the more automatic it becomes. And what was once strategy begins to harden into identity. Over time, you stop noticing the difference between who you are and who you learn to be. The external self, the one shaped by environment, starts to feel like the only self that exists. Meanwhile, the internal self doesn't disappear. It simply becomes quieter, less expressed, more observed than lived. And this creates a subtle split. One part of you performs life. The other part watches it happen. But the most unsettling part is not the split itself. It is the fact that both begin to feel equally real. And once that confusion settles in, the question is no longer how the mask formed, but what it is still hiding underneath it. Over time, the mask stops feeling like something you put on. It becomes something that wakes up before you do. What once required awareness slowly turns into habit loops running in the background of your behavior. You no longer consciously decide how to act in every situation. Instead, your responses begin to fire automatically, pre-built reactions shaped by repetition, reward, and avoidance of discomfort. You don't think, how should I behave here? You simply become the version of yourself that has worked before. And that is where fragmentation begins. In one space, you are the friend who listens and laughs at the right moments. In another, you are the student or worker who performs competence and control. In another, you are the partner who adapts emotionally to maintain stability. Each role feels slightly different, but over time, they stop feeling like roles at all. They start feeling like separate versions of you. The brain is not trying to deceive you. It is optimizing. It learns which behaviors reduce rejection, which ones increase acceptance, and which emotional expressions create smoother social outcomes. And without realizing it, authenticity slowly becomes less important than predictability. So emotions that don't fit the situation begin to get suppressed, not because they are untrue, but because they are inconvenient. Frustration gets softened, vulnerability gets delayed, confusion gets hidden behind composure. And every time this happens, something small is traded away without notice, self-awareness, because awareness requires interruption, and habit does not pause to ask permission. Eventually, you stop observing your behavior in real time. You only see the results of it after the moment has already passed. You reflect on what you said, how you acted, how you were perceived. but not on the fact that it happened without conscious direction. That is the quiet turning point. When life is no longer something you are actively living, but something you are consistently performing well enough to not disrupt. And the most unsettling part is that nothing feels obviously wrong. It feels efficient, stable, normal. Until one day you notice there is very little space between who is acting and who is watching. There is a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when something inside you starts to resist the role you are playing. At first, it is subtle. A slight discomfort when you say something you don't fully believe. A small pause after laughing at something that didn't actually feel funny. A tightening in your chest when you agree, when every part of you wanted to disagree. It does not arrive loudly. It arrives as friction. This is where the conflict begins. Not between you and the world, but between you and yourself. You start living inside a split experience. One part of you is performing smoothly, responding, adapting, maintaining the version of you that fits the situation. But another part, quieter, more sensitive, is observing everything and quietly questioning it. And the gap between these two begins to create tension. Psychologists might call it cognitive dissonance, but in lived experience, it feels more like internal contradiction. You are saying one thing while feeling another. You are acting in one direction while your internal state pulls in a different one, and neither side fully disappears. Over time, this mismatch does not stay harmless. It starts to accumulate. You feel it as emotional fatigue, not the kind that comes from physical effort, but from constant adjustment, from continuously recalibrating yourself depending on where you are, who you are with, and what is expected of you. Every interaction becomes a small act of translation between what is real inside and what is acceptable outside. And in that translation, something gets drained. Not suddenly, but steadily. Yet even within this exhaustion, something else begins to emerge. A pressure that does not fully belong to stress or tiredness. It feels more like a voice trying to push through layers of practiced behavior. A moment of honesty that almost breaks through before being softened again. This is the voice of authenticity. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. It shows up in hesitation. In the moments you stop mid-sentence because what you are about to say does not match what you actually feel. In the silent awareness that you are adjusting yourself again, even as you do it. And when this continues long enough, anxiety begins to appear, not as random fear, but as a signal. A kind of internal alarm system reacting to prolonged misalignment. Something in you recognizes that the distance between your felt self and your performed self is becoming too wide to ignore. But instead of resolving it, you often adapt further. You refine the mask. You improve the performance. You become more skilled at functioning without disrupting the image you have built. Until the discomfort is no longer just a momentary feeling, it becomes a background condition. A quiet war that never fully ends, only deepens. The most difficult part of removing the mask is not that it is fake, it is that it works. From the outside, the world does not respond to your internal truth. It responds to what it can perceive, what it can understand, what it can predict. And over time, it begins to reward the version of you that is stable, pleasing, and socially legible. So the mask becomes reinforced, not through force but through feedback. A well-timed laugh gets approval. A controlled emotional response earns trust. A confident tone opens doors. A calm presence avoids conflict. And slowly, without anyone explicitly teaching you, you begin to learn a silent rule. Certain versions of you move the world forward more easily than others, so you keep them. Because every time you perform well, you are not just noticed, you are validated. And that validation begins to feel like survival. The deeper problem is that people around you rarely interact with anything beyond this constructed version. They respond to the tone, the behavior, the personality that has been optimized for interaction. They don't necessarily see the internal hesitation behind your words or the emotional effort behind your calmness. They see what works, and what works becomes what is expected. This is where identity begins to lock in place socially. Not because you are trapped, but because deviation becomes costly. If you step outside the version people recognize, the reaction changes. Confusion appears, distance grows, approval weakens, and the brain remembers that quickly. So even the idea of dropping the mask starts to feel risky. Not abstractly risky, socially, emotionally, even economically risky, because your identity is no longer just personal. It is functional. It has roles, consequences, dependencies attached to it, and that is where attachment forms. You begin to rely on the very thing that distances you from yourself. Approval becomes a loop. You act in a certain way, receive positive feedback, and the behavior strengthens. The cycle repeats until the performance is no longer something you consciously maintain. It becomes something you unconsciously protect. And yet, somewhere beneath the reinforcement, there is a quiet frustration that builds over time. A sense that you are being seen, but not fully known. That you are being accepted, but not entirely as you are. But even that frustration is not enough to easily break the pattern. Because the mask is no longer just something you wear in front of others. It has become the reason others continue to stay. There comes a moment when something strange happens inside you. You are in the middle of speaking, reacting, existing, and suddenly, a part of you steps back. Not physically, but mentally. It is as if another version of you is watching the performance unfold in real time. You notice the tone of your voice before the sentence even finishes. You become aware of the facial expression forming as it happens. You catch yourself selecting words not because they are fully true, but because they are socially smooth. And in that instant, life splits into two layers, the one acting and the one observing. This is the emergence of the observer within. At first it feels subtle, almost like a coincidence, a rare moment of self-awareness. But once it appears, it begins to repeat. You start noticing yourself more often than you expected. Not after the moment, but during it. And that changes everything. Because now, you are no longer fully inside the experience. You are partially outside of it, watching it unfold like a scene you are both participating in and analysing at the same time. This creates a strange distance. Your actions continue, but they are no longer fully unconscious. There is a layer of awareness hovering above them, quietly questioning, quietly recognising patterns that were previously invisible. And with this recognition comes something both powerful and unsettling. You begin to see the mask as it is being worn, not as a memory, not as reflection, but in real time. You notice how quickly you adjust depending on who is in front of you. You notice the subtle shifts in personality, tone, and emotional expression. You notice how fluid identity actually is when you are paying attention. And the more you observe, the less solid the idea of a fixed self becomes. Because what you once called me now appears more like a continuous process than a stable entity. This is where psychological detachment begins, not as escape but as awareness. You are still acting, still participating, still speaking, but something fundamental has changed. You are no longer only the character in the story, you are also the witness watching the character unfold. And once this division becomes clear, the question of control begins to quietly surface underneath everything else. It doesn't happen like a dramatic breakdown, it happens quietly, in the middle of normal life. One moment you are performing the version of yourself that you've refined over years, responding correctly, adjusting smoothly, maintaining the structure that keeps everything stable. And then, almost unexpectedly, something inside loosens. A thought appears that feels almost too simple to be real. You are not actually in danger, not in the way you've been behaving as if you are. The fear that once held the mask in place, the fear of rejection, disapproval, losing connection, starts to feel less absolute. Not gone, but less convincing, as if it no longer fully matches the present moment. And in that gap, something shifts. You begin to notice that the mask was never truly required for survival. It was required for comfort, for acceptance, for predictability, but not for existence itself. That realization doesn't arrive as relief at first. It arrives as instability. Because if you are not in danger without the performance, then what exactly has been driving the performance all along? For a brief moment, the system wavers. You say something slightly more honest than usual. You pause instead of filling the silence. You allow a reaction to exist without immediately shaping it. And nothing collapses. Nothing breaks. In fact, something unexpected happens. The tension reduces. Not completely, but enough for you to notice there might be another way of being here. A more integrated self begins to appear in fragments. Not a new identity, but a loosening of the separation between what is felt and what is shown. The internal and external stop fighting for control in quite the same way. But this is not comfort yet, because being real after long adaptation does not feel natural. It feels exposed. Like standing without practiced armor. Like existing without translation. And that exposure carries its own kind of discomfort. Not because authenticity is dangerous, but because it is unfamiliar enough to feel uncertain. And in that uncertainty, everything you thought was fixed begins to open slightly. It doesn't end with the mask disappearing. It ends with it losing its authority. What once felt automatic becomes optional. You still adapt, still adjust, still move through different versions of yourself depending on context. But the difference is that you are no longer lost inside them. There is awareness now where there was once only reaction. You can see when a response is shaped for approval, and you can choose whether to continue it or soften it. You can feel the moment a role begins to form, without being fully consumed by it. And that small space between impulse and action becomes everything. Identity stops behaving like something fixed. It becomes fluid, responsive, alive, not a single mask, not a single truth, but a shifting presence that you are no longer trapped inside. The internal conflict that once felt constant begins to quiet down, not because contradictions disappear, but because they are no longer forced to fight for dominance. They are simply observed. And in that observation, something stabilizes. Not perfection, not certainty, but a quiet kind of clarity. A sense that you are no longer trying to become someone at every moment. You are simply aware of being here, without needing to constantly perform it. And even now, after everything, one question still quietly follows you. Which version of you is making this choice right now? Not the answer you give quickly, but the one you notice if you pause long enough to observe it happening, because the mask never truly disappears. It simply becomes visible, recognized, no longer unconscious. You still adapt, still shift, still respond to the world. But now there is a witness inside it all, watching, noticing, remembering that none of it is entirely fixed. And in that awareness, something fundamental changes. Freedom was never about escaping the mask completely. It was about seeing it while it is being worn. Because the moment you can observe yourself becoming someone, you are no longer fully trapped inside that becoming. And that quiet space of awareness, that is where something closer to truth begins to live.